The slap echoed through the diner. The woman staggered. Coffee spilled across the floor. No one moved. Imagine sitting in a quiet diner and watching power abuse itself right in front of you. Would you stay silent? At a corner table sat a Navy SEAL, a disciplined canine lying silent at his feet. No reaction. No movement. Not a single word. But what happens when unbreakable restraint meets unchecked arrogance? The man wearing the badge had grown used to silence in this town. Used to fear. Used to people looking away. Authority had made him believe he was untouchable. That belief was wrong. The limits he challenged belonged to a Navy SEAL who knew exactly when to strike. Before we begin, tell us in the comments where you're watching from right now. If this story moves you, hit that subscribe button to Heartline Stories, so you never miss a tale of quiet courage. Late autumn in western Colorado didn't announce itself with romance. It arrived like a quiet warning that sank into the seams of everything, into the thin air, into the wood frames of old buildings, into the breath that turned white the instant it left your mouth. A weak, pale sun hovered behind low cloud cover. The highway cut through the foothills in long gray stretches, bordered by pines and patches of early snow that looked more like ash than winter. The town was the kind travelers missed if they blinked. One main road, a few dim storefronts, and a roadside diner, sitting at the edge of gravel and wind, its neon sign stuttering in and out, like it was deciding whether to stay alive. Inside that diner, warmth existed only because the heater fought hard. People spoke softly, because they'd learned volume attracted the wrong kind of attention. Daniel Brooks rolled in without drama. An old pickup crunching across the lot. Tires spitting stones. Engine ticking as it cooled. He sat for a beat, with both hands on the wheel. Shoulders relaxed. Chin slightly lowered. Eyes taking in the windows. The door. The lone cruiser. Parked a little too confidently near the side of the building. Daniel was 34. Tall. Lean-muscled. The kind of strength that looked understated. Until it moved. His sandy blonde hair was cut short in a strict military style. Tight at the sides. Short on top. No fashionable fade. Because habit was easier than reinvention. A short boxed beard framed his jaw neat and clipped. A thin pale scar ran along the jawline, like an old punctuation mark. His hazel eyes carried the steady watchfulness of a man trained to notice what others missed. But his face carried no invitation to conversation. No threat either. Just presence. Controlled and quiet. He wore a Navy working uniform. Type 3 and or 2 green blouse and trousers. Matching Velcro patches. Blank. No name. No rank. No insignia. And tan combat boots dusted with road grit. He looked like someone who had left a place in a hurry and hadn't bothered to become anyone else yet. At his left side, the canine moved as if the cold couldn't touch him. The Belgian Malinois was 5 years old. Compact. Powerfully built. Fawn coat laid under a dark black overlay along his back and face, making his amber eyes seem even darker when he focused. The dog's chest was broad. Legs spring-loaded. Posture disciplined. No wasted motion. No nervous scanning. Only calm. Professional readiness. Shaped by repetition and trust. He wore a worn leather collar. Plain and functional. Later, he'd use a matte black tactical harness. But tonight, it was only the collar. The dog's identity kept quiet. The same way Daniel kept his. The Malinois stayed close without crowding. Matching Daniel's pace. Head level. Ears reading the world. He wasn't a pet drifting beside his owner. He was a working partner who understood silence as a tool. Daniel stepped out, the wind catching the hem of his blouse. Together they crossed the gravel and pushed into the diner. The bell above the door gave a thin tire jingle. That didn't carry much cheer. Warmth hit first, then smell. Burnt coffee, old grease, a faint sweetness from something overcooked hours ago, and the low murmur of people trying to keep their lives small. The diner was narrow. Cracked vinyl booths. Scuffed linoleum. A counter wiped so many times. The surface looked permanently tired. Near the windows sat 4 immigrant workers. Late 20s to early 40s. Faces worn by outdoor labor and long hours. Jackets heavy. Hands rough. Their voices kept low in Spanish, not because they were ashamed, but because they'd learned in places like this that being noticed could become a problem faster than it became kindness. One of them, a man with a weathered face and salt and pepper stubble, kept glancing toward the door, like he expected someone to come in and decide he didn't belong. Another, younger, had bruised knuckles and a careful stillness, the kind that came from trying to stay employed in a town that could swallow you without leaving a trace. Behind the counter moved Lena Parker, early 30s, tall, slender, quiet, tired grace, auburn hair pulled into a loose bun that never stayed neat for long, pale skin freckled lightly across her nose, green eyes that carried softness, but also the guarded patience of someone who'd learned to keep her reactions inside her chest. Lena was polite to everyone, in the way people become polite when politeness is armor. She smiled even when she didn't feel it, apologized even when she wasn't at fault, moved through the space with shoulders slightly rounded, as if she'd spent years trying not to take up too much room. There was an old story in that posture. An ex-husband who left, a custody fight that taught her how quickly a woman's truth could be dismissed in a small town. So now she worked hard, spoke softly, survived by not giving powerful men a reason to turn their attention toward her. Daniel chose a corner booth, with his back to the wall, a habit that didn't announce itself as tactical, unless someone knew what they were looking at. The Malinois slipped under the table and lay flat, chin on paws, nearly invisible, present, but not displayed, because discipline meant being ready, without being theatrical. When Lena came over, Daniel ordered the cheapest breakfast item on the menu, in a steady, polite voice. No extra words. He ate slowly when it arrived, methodically, cutting each piece with an economy of motion. Halfway through, he slid a portion down for the dog. The Malinois accepted it without sound, tail barely moving, chewing with controlled restraint. The kind of quiet that came from training, and from knowing his handler's expectations were absolute. The bell over the door rang again, sharper this time. The diner's murmur thinned, the way a room changes when something unwanted enters. Mark Holloway stepped inside. He didn't look like a man who ever asked permission to exist. Holloway was in his late 40s, tall enough to loom, heavy through the chest and waist, his deputy uniform worn like possession, rather than service. Cheeks ruddy, nose slightly swollen, eyes small and restless, thinning dark hair slicked back with too much product. An attempt at control that couldn't hide years of drinking. A short uneven beard clung to his jaw, more neglect than style, lines around his mouth pulled downward, into permanent impatience, as if the world owed him comfort, and he resented it every moment it didn't pay. His sidearm sat at his hip, his hand drifted near the grip, in an almost lazy way, not because he feared anything in this diner, but because he enjoyed the reminder of what the badge and the weapon made possible. He didn't greet the owner, didn't nod at the customers. He looked at people the way you look at furniture you expect to obey you. A couple of locals went still. The immigrant workers dropped their eyes toward their cups. Lena's hands tightened around a coffee pot for half a beat, then forced them loose again, because in her body lived a memory of what happened when she showed fear or anger. Holloway sat at the counter and barked an order without saying please, then laughed once at something no one else could hear. Loud, sudden, a laugh that landed like a slap, even before his hand ever moved. Lena moved quickly, careful, steps measured, voice soft. She set the mug down, and for a moment everything looked like it would pass the way it always passed. Quiet, ugly, survivable, until her elbow clipped the edge of the pot. Coffee splashed across the counter, a few drops hitting Holloway's sleeve. The slap sounded like a crack of wood breaking, sharp enough to cut through the diner's stale air. Lena's head snapped to the side. She stumbled half a step, her bun loosening, a strand of auburn hair falling across her cheek. Her face went still, in the stunned way bodies go still when they're trying to decide whether pain is real or whether admitting it will make it worse. A red mark bloomed instantly along her cheekbone. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. Her hand rose halfway, then stopped, hovering, As if touching her face might turn the moment into something officially true. Holloway stood over her, breath thick with alcohol and contempt, eyes bright with the satisfaction of being watched and not challenged. "Watch what you're doing," he said, voice loud enough for everyone, the tone of a man performing power. "You people get lazy when you think nobody's paying attention." The phrase "you people" hung in the air, without choosing a target, which made it worse. Could be Lena. It could be the immigrant workers. It could be anyone Holloway wanted to shrink. No one spoke. The cook stayed hidden in the kitchen. A local man in a booth stared down at his plate, like it contained instructions for survival. One of the immigrant workers clenched his jaw so hard the muscle jumped, but he kept his hands wrapped around his cup, because he knew how fast a town could turn against someone without paperwork, without witnesses, without consequence. Lena swallowed, straightened slowly, forced a small apology that didn't belong to her, because she had learned that apologies sometimes bought you time. Daniel saw it all, and did not move. He didn't stand. He didn't speak. His posture remained easy, shoulders relaxed, hands calm, eyes steady on Holloway, without the heat of anger, without the softness of pleading. Under the table, the Malinois tightened like a drawn wire, muscles shifting beneath his short coat, amber eyes locking on Holloway's boots, a low vibration of readiness humming in his chest. Daniel's foot pressed lightly against the dog's shoulder, barely a touch, a private signal, and the Malinois stayed down, disciplined, silent, because he had been trained to wait for permission, the way other dogs waited for food. Daniel's silence wasn't weakness. It was restraint, a controlled decision, not to feed the scene with reaction. But Mark Holloway didn't understand restraint. In Holloway's world, the loud ruled, and the quiet submitted. He turned then, scanning the diner for eyes that looked away, for bodies that flinched, and his gaze landed on Daniel, on the blank Velcro patches, the calm face, the dog hidden under the booth, the absence of apology in Daniel's posture. Holloway misread the stillness as fear, and the quiet as surrender. Something in his expression curled into a smirk, the look of a man who had found a new object to press down, just to prove he could. Daniel held his gaze, without challenging it, without lowering his eyes either. Present, in a way that didn't beg, and didn't threaten. The Malinois stayed flat beneath the table, like a shadow that had learned discipline. Holloway's smirk widened, because to him silence was an invitation. In that instant, he decided the stranger in the corner booth was the next lesson this town would watch. Without intervening, the diner did not recover its breath after the slap, simply learned to hold it longer. Sound returned in pieces, the heater ticking, a spoon clinking against ceramic, the faint scrape of a chair leg. But conversation stayed buried, and the people inside arranged their bodies the way animals do when a predator decides to linger. Lena Parker stood behind the counter, hands folded loosely in front of her apron, shoulders set in a posture she had practiced for years, tall but slightly rounded, the way a woman learns to look when standing straight has cost her before. She was a single mother to a boy who slept through mornings because she worked nights, a boy who asked careful questions and learned early not to expect promises to be kept, and the history of that responsibility lived in Lena's movements. She wiped the counter slowly, deliberately, eyes lowered. Not in submission but in calculation, because she had reported Mark Holloway once already years ago, after a night when his temper had turned toward her in a back hallway, and the report had vanished, the way smoke does when a window is opened, leaving behind only the smell, and the lesson that paper did not protect you if the hands holding it belonged to the wrong man. She had learned then to survive by endurance, rather than resistance, to keep records in her head, to remember dates and words. Even when the town pretended none of it had happened, Daniel Brooks remained in his booth, finishing the last of his meal without haste, the kind of measured pace that suggested he did not intend to be hurried out by tension or authority. The Belgian Malinois stayed beneath the table, body still, eyes alert, a disciplined presence that drew no attention, yet changed the temperature of the space for those who noticed. The dog's coat caught the low diner light in dull gold and shadow. His breath steady, his awareness fixed. Not on the people who feared Holloway, but on the man himself. Because training had taught him that danger did not announce itself with noise. Daniel's face gave nothing away. Not anger, not fear, not pity, only attention. And that unsettled people more than a reaction would have. Because attention implied memory, and memory implied consequence. George Miller, the diner's owner, stood near the register, pretending to count bills he already knew by heart. He was in his early 60s, thick through the shoulders from decades underground, hands scarred and knotted from mining work that had paid his way, until the mines closed and left him with a cough that never quite went away. His hair was thin and gray, posture slightly stooped, but his eyes were sharp, and behind them lived a long catalog of things he had seen and chosen not to challenge. George had opened the diner after the mine shut down, because he needed a place that would not abandon him the way the company had. And he had kept it alive through winters and bad seasons, by learning when to speak, and when to keep his mouth closed. He knew exactly how often Holloway came in without paying, how often the camera malfunctioned afterward, and how many recordings he had quietly duplicated and hidden over the years, not out of bravery, but out of a private refusal to let the town erase its own history completely. Near the far end of the counter, Evan Reed sat stiffly on a stool. Uniform too new, posture too careful. He was 23, recently out of the academy, with a clean-cut look that still believed in rules, because rules were what had brought him here. Evan's hair was neatly trimmed, boots polished with an attention that bordered on anxiety. Hands rested flat on his thighs, as if afraid they might betray him if they moved. He had grown up 2 counties over, the son of a mechanic who taught him that authority was earned by consistency, not fear, and that belief had followed him into the badge he wore now. Watching Holloway had already strained that belief. Witnessing the slap had tightened it into something painful, because Evan knew it was wrong, knew it should be reported, and also knew, with a clarity that left him nauseous, that reporting it through the usual channels would lead straight back to the man who controlled them. He glanced once toward Daniel, then toward Lena, then looked away, jaw tight, because courage without a plan felt like another way to get people hurt. Daniel rose when he finished eating, movements unhurried, chair sliding back softly. He approached the counter with a calm that drew Holloway's attention. Even before Daniel spoke, he placed his cash down carefully, counting out the amount with precision, then added more, folding the bills so they lay flat and visible. "That covers mine," he said quietly, voice steady and polite. "And what was missed earlier?" George looked up, startled, and for a second, the weight of the gesture hit him harder than any confrontation would have. His fingers trembled slightly as he took the money, not because of the amount, but because someone had acknowledged the debt, without making a spectacle of it. Lena saw it too, the simple act of recognition, and something behind her eyes shifted, a small, dangerous thing, like hope, that she forced herself to push back down, because hope had a habit of getting punished here. Daniel turned away from the counter and reached into the pocket of his blouse. He removed a small scrap of paper, already folded, and placed it beneath the edge of the plate he had used. Not drawing attention, not explaining. On it was a phone number, written in careful block letters. No name, no unit, no context. Just a number that belonged to a line he no longer used often. A relic of a life where calls were short, and decisions carried weight. He did not look at Lena when he left it there, because he understood that asking someone to meet your eyes could feel like asking them to risk something they weren't ready to risk yet. He walked toward the door, the Malinois rising smoothly, and falling in at his side. And that was when Holloway moved. The deputy positioned himself in the doorway, with an easy confidence. One boot angled outward, body turned just enough to block passage, without appearing overt, a trick learned through repetition. He rested one hand on the grip of his handgun, thumb brushing the worn leather of the holster, in a casual practiced motion, meant to remind everyone who decided how situations ended in this town. The diner seemed to shrink around him, walls pressing inward, the exit suddenly theoretical, rather than real. "Leaving already?" Holloway said, voice carrying the lazy drawl of a man who enjoyed hearing himself speak when others had to listen. His eyes flicked briefly to the dog, then back to Daniel's face, measuring. The Malinois stopped when Daniel stopped, muscles tensing but contained, gaze fixed on Holloway's midsection, reading balance and intent. The way he had been trained to do. Daniel did not raise his hands, did not touch the dog. He stood with shoulders relaxed, posture easy, as if he were waiting for permission to exit a private home, rather than a public space. "Yes," he said. Nothing more. Tone respectful. Without submission. Holloway stepped closer, crowding the space deliberately, hand still near the gun. "Funny," he said, eyes narrowing. "You don't look like most drifters." The words were bait, and the room knew it. One of the immigrant workers glanced up briefly, then backed down. The reflexive caution of a man who had learned that someone else's confrontation could spill onto anyone nearby. Evan Reed shifted on his stool, then went still again, fear and principle colliding behind his eyes. Daniel did not answer the comment, because he understood that explanations were invitations, and invitations could be twisted into permissions. Silence, used correctly, was a boundary. The Malinois remained perfectly still. A quiet, living measure of control that contrasted sharply with Holloway's performative dominance. Holloway's gaze dropped briefly toward the dog, lips curling. "Big animal," he said. "Yours?" "Yes," Daniel replied, the single word measured. Final. For a moment, Holloway said nothing, and in that moment, the diner held its breath again, each person calculating what the next movement would cost them. Lena's eyes flicked to the paper under the plate, and back to Daniel's back, her mind already racing through what that number might mean, and whether using it would put a target on her that she couldn't survive. George Miller shifted his weight, the memory of hidden recordings heavy in his chest, and wondered if this was the night the balance tipped. Evan Reed felt his pulse in his ears, and hated himself for not knowing how to act without making things worse. "I don't like surprises," Holloway said at last, voice lower now, edged with irritation. "And I don't like strangers who think they can tell folks how to run their business." His eyes flicked toward the counter, then back to Daniel, making sure everyone understood who he meant. Daniel met his gaze calmly, the same steady attention as before, and said only one sentence, voice even, posture unchanged. "I'm leaving." The words did not challenge Holloway. They did not insult him. They simply refused to yield ground that had not been his to take, and that refusal landed harder than any argument could have. Holloway's jaw tightened, hand resting a little more firmly on the holster, and in that tightening, everyone in the diner understood that something had shifted, not toward violence yet, but toward inevitability, the kind that comes when power meets restraint, and mistakes silence for permission. The sentence had barely settled in the air. "I'm leaving," when the temperature in the diner changed in a way no heater could correct. It wasn't louder, wasn't faster, but heavier, as if the room itself had leaned in to see what would happen when authority met refusal. Mark Holloway's face tightened, the ruddy flush on his cheeks darkening, as pride curdled into something sharper, more impatient, and more dangerous, because he had built his place in this town on the assumption that nobody ever told him where a line was. He took a step closer, crowding Daniel Brooks until the space between them collapsed into inches, breath carrying the stale bite of alcohol and contempt, eyes flicking once toward the watching faces, as if to make sure there was an audience to remember this moment correctly. Then, without warning, his hand came up and struck Daniel across the face, open-palmed and vicious, the sound snapping through the diner like a board breaking under sudden weight. Daniel staggered half a step, more from surprise than pain, head turning with the blow, taste of iron blooming briefly on his tongue. But he did not raise his hands, did not reach for Holloway, because instinct and discipline both told him that the second after impact was where men made irreversible mistakes. Beneath the table, the Belgian Malinois surged to his feet in a blur of muscle and intent, a low growl rolling up from his chest, raw and immediate, body angled forward, weight shifting to his front legs, as every line of training screamed that his handler had been attacked. Daniel's voice cut through the sound before it could become something else. Firm, precise, a single command, delivered without volume, but with absolute authority. And the dog stopped mid-motion, muscles still quivering, ears pinned forward, eyes locked on Holloway, while his body lowered back to the floor. Obedience wrestled into place by years of repetition and trust. A ripple of shock moved through the diner, chairs scraping softly as people shifted without standing. Lena Parker froze behind the counter, one hand pressed to her mouth, eyes wide, not just with fear, but with the recognition that something had crossed from the familiar cruelty she endured into open violence that could not be dismissed as an accident or a misunderstanding. George Miller felt his chest tighten painfully, old miner's lungs struggling, as he watched the scene he had feared for years finally unfold in front of witnesses who would not forget it. And Evan Reed's stomach dropped as the sound of the slap echoed in his ears, because this was no longer a gray area or a paperwork problem. It was a crime happening in plain sight, and his training offered no comfort for how to stop it without destroying himself in the process. Holloway smiled, a short, ugly curve of the mouth that fed on reaction, and he raised his hand again, enjoying the moment, enjoying the power of being able to strike a man who did not beg or break, because humiliation mattered more to him than pain. Daniel shifted, then not forward, and not in anger, but sideways, turning just enough that the second blow cut through empty air. Holloway's momentum carrying him past balance, as his boot caught the edge of a chair leg. The space was too tight, the diner too crowded with bodies and furniture for recovery, and Holloway went down hard, crashing into a table, plates clattering and shattering across the floor, coffee sloshing and spilling, as he hit the linoleum in a tangle of limbs and fury. For a fraction of a second, no one breathed, the sound of broken ceramic hanging in the air like punctuation. Holloway pushed himself up, face flushing a deeper red, as laughter died in his throat, and was replaced by something wild and desperate, because losing his footing meant losing the script, and losing the script meant losing control. His hand flew to his sidearm, fingers wrapping the grip, as the metallic click of the holster echoed louder than it should have in the confined space. "On the ground!" he shouted, voice cracking with rage and authority intertwined. "You're resisting." The words came automatically, a charge built to justify whatever followed. Daniel did not argue, did not raise his voice, did not attempt to explain physics or intent to a man who was no longer listening. Slowly, and deliberately, he lowered himself to the floor, lying flat on his stomach, hands moving behind his back in a controlled motion that communicated compliance without surrender. His attention split between Holloway's unstable breathing and the living tension of the dog behind him. "Stay," Daniel said quietly, the word meant for the Malinois alone, and the dog obeyed, lowering himself again with rigid discipline, eyes never leaving Holloway, body a coiled line of restraint, held in place by command, rather than fear. Holloway advanced, knee pressing into Daniel's back, as he forced the man's wrists together, the cuffs snapping shut with unnecessary force. Each click a declaration, meant to be heard and remembered. Lena flinched at the sound, tears welling despite her effort to contain them, because she recognized the ritual now. The way the narrative would be written without her voice, unless something changed. Outside, cold air rushed in as the door opened. The sound of a police radio crackled briefly, before Holloway dragged Daniel to his feet and pushed him toward the exit. Grip rough, jaw clenched, eyes scanning the room, as if daring anyone to speak. No one did. The immigrant workers remained seated, shoulders tight, because they understood that bravery was expensive when you had no receipt to prove you belonged. Evan Reed stood frozen, hands trembling slightly at his sides, watching the man he had admired in uniform twist the law into a weapon, and hating himself for not knowing how to intervene without becoming the next example. Outside, the Malinois was halted at the threshold by Holloway's shouted order. Another deputy stepping forward to grab the dog's collar, and loop a length of rope around a metal post near the diner's entrance. The deputy was older, heavier, with tired eyes and a resigned posture. Someone who had learned to follow instructions, because resistance had not paid off in a long time. He avoided the dog's gaze as he tied the knot. Evan copied the files methodically, labeling them with dates and times, saving them onto a small drive he had brought from home, because he had learned from his father that evidence only mattered if it survived the first attempt to erase it. When he finished, he logged out, erased the access trail as best he could, and sat for a moment longer, hands flat on the desk, feeling the weight of a decision he could not undo. Crosstown. George Miller unlocked the diner early and worked alone in the quiet, the smell of disinfectant sharp in the air as he wiped down counters that had seen too much. He moved more slowly than he used to, old injuries making themselves known in the cold, but his eyes were clear, and the resolve he had avoided for years had finally settled into his bones. George had been a miner long enough to understand pressure. He knew that collapse happened not from a single crack, but from many ignored ones. And the night before had been a warning he could no longer store away in drawers and pretend didn't exist. Lena Parker arrived while it was still dark, cheek faintly bruised, hair pulled back tightly, as if order might keep memory at bay. She moved stiffly, usual softness replaced by something brittle, because seeing Daniel taken had done what years of quiet endurance had not. It had shown her that silence protected the wrong people. George closed the door behind them, without preamble, led her into the small office at the back, opened a metal cabinet that bore old scratches and dents, like a history written in blows. Inside were envelopes and drives wrapped in plastic, each marked with dates and brief notes. He set them on the desk carefully, hand steady now. "I kept copies," he said, voice low and plain. "Every time he made me erase something, I kept a copy." Lena stared at the stack, breath catching painfully, because in those objects lived proof that she had not imagined her own fear, that the report she'd filed and watched disappear had once been real. She touched one envelope as if it might burn her, then withdrew her hand, nodding once, because understanding had begun to replace terror. Outside, the Belgian Malinois waited where he had been tied the night before, rope replaced now by a chain clipped loosely to a post near the station. He stood tall and alert, fawn and black coat dull in the winter light, amber eyes tracking every movement across the street. The dog was 5 years old, trained for precision and patience, and he bore waiting with a rigid dignity that unsettled passers-by. He did not whine, did not pace, did not lie down to sleep. He simply watched, because loyalty was not loud. It was constant. A local woman named Sarah Whitcomb stopped across from him on her way to the grocery, pausing despite herself. Sarah was in her late 40s, tall and spare, gray threaded through dark hair she wore pulled back in a practical twist, posture upright, in a way that spoke of long habits of responsibility. She had worked as a school secretary for decades, knew every family story worth knowing, and had learned after a bitter divorce that kindness needed boundaries to survive. She studied the dog for a moment, noting the calm intensity, the absence of panic, and something in her expression softened. "Good boy," she murmured, not reaching out, understanding without instruction that this animal did not belong to strangers. The Malinois flicked an ear but did not break focus, and Sarah moved on, with a frown that would follow her into conversations later that day. At the end of the second night, Holloway opened Daniel's cell with an expression of practiced boredom, papers in hand. "You're free to go," he said flatly. "No charges." The words were delivered like a favor, not an admission, and Holloway leaned closer, lowering his voice just enough to carry threat without witnesses. "I suggest you leave town today." Daniel rose smoothly, wrists aching, face composed, did not ask why, did not offer thanks, because he understood the language being used, and the limits of what could be said here. Outside, cold air cut cleanly, honest in a way the town had not been, and the Malinois stiffened the instant Daniel appeared, chain rattling softly as the dog surged forward. Before checking himself at the end of it, Daniel knelt, one hand sinking into the thick fur at the dog's neck, grounding himself in the familiar weight and warmth. Easy, he said quietly. I'm here. The dog leaned into the touch, tension easing but not vanishing, because readiness was part of who he was. Daniel did not return to the diner that morning. He went to his truck, gathered his things, made a series of calls from a payphone near the edge of town. Voice low, words precise. He contacted a military investigative liaison he trusted, a man whose understanding of procedure was matched by a respect for timing. Then a federal inspector, whose name had been passed quietly between units when local systems failed. He did not dramatize, did not accuse, provided facts, locations, and the promise of material evidence. Each call was short, deliberate, because systems responded best when approached without heat. When he finished, he drove back toward the station, not to confront anyone, but to retrieve what was his. Holloway watched from across the lot, arms folded, expression unreadable, and said nothing as Daniel unhooked the chain and guided the Malinois into the truck. The message had already been delivered. Watching was all Holloway had left. By the time Daniel pulled away, the town was beginning to feel it. Sarah Whitcomb spoke to a neighbor in the grocery aisle. Voice quiet, but firm. Lena Parker sat in the diner's office with George Miller, sorting envelopes, her fear reshaping itself into purpose. Evan Reed placed the drive into his locker and locked it with hands that no longer shook as badly. None of it was loud, none of it was violent, but it moved like pressure redistributing itself beneath the surface, seeking a place to break through. Daniel drove to the edge of town and stopped briefly, resting his hand on the steering wheel. The Malinois sitting upright beside him, eyes forward, ready. He did not look back at the diner or the station. He did not need to. The truth had begun to move, and once moving, it did not require him to stand in its path. He started the engine and headed out, leaving behind a town that had not yet changed, but soon would, because silence, once cracked, did not seal itself easily again. Snow began the way it always did in the high country, not with drama, but with decision. It drifted down in thin, patient lines that softened edges and muffled sound, settling over the town as if to quiet it after a long argument. By the time the black Federal sedan rolled in, its tires whispering against the wet pavement, the diner's windows were already glowing again. Light steady, neon sign no longer flickering. The town had not gathered to watch. Never did. Justice, when it finally arrived here, preferred an audience that kept its distance. The federal inspector stepped out first. A woman in her early 50s named Margaret Doyle. Tall, square-shouldered, dark coat buttoned high against the cold, hair pulled back tight in a practical knot that left no room for vanity. She moved with the unhurried certainty of someone who had learned that authority did not need to announce itself to function. Years in oversight had shaped her manner. Direct, unsentimental, allergic to spectacle. She nodded once to the agents behind her, then crossed the street toward the station, without looking around, because she already knew where she was going, and why. Inside, Mark Holloway tried to laugh it off at first, face pale beneath the familiar flush, beard untrimmed, uniform pressed but worn thin by habit. He argued procedure, questioned jurisdiction, raised his voice when calm didn't work, then went quiet when the cuffs came out, and the words pattern of abuse were spoken plainly, without accusation, without heat. Power left him quickly once it left him officially. Stripped of noise and weapon, he looked smaller than anyone remembered, shoulders sagging, eyes darting for allies who did not step forward. There were no cheers when he was let out, no shouted vindication, only the scrape of boots on concrete, and the soft click of a cruiser door closing, the sound final, without being loud. Evan Reed stood near the back of the room, hands clasped tightly in front of him, uniform suddenly fitting differently, now that he was using it for what it had been meant for. He spoke when asked, voice steady enough to surprise himself, describing what he had seen, what he had copied, what he had preserved when erasure had been expected. Evan was still young, still carried the clean lines of someone who had not yet been worn down by compromise. And the act of testifying did not turn him into a hero, so much as it turned him into himself. When he finished, He exhaled slowly, the weight in his chest shifting, because fear did not disappear, but it changed shape when it was finally named. Lena Parker sat in a quiet room off the main hall, hands wrapped around a paper cup she had not touched. A witness advocate spoke to her in a calm, practiced voice, explaining protections, procedures, timelines, the language careful and clear. Lena listened, nodding, posture straighter than it had been weeks ago, because something fundamental had altered inside her. She was still tall, slender, soft-spoken, cautious by nature, but now her caution had direction. The slap on her cheek had faded to yellow, but the memory remained sharp, not as pain but as proof. When she signed the papers placed in front of her, her hand did not tremble. The diner opened that afternoon like it always had, doorbell chiming softly, smell of coffee settling into the air. But the atmosphere was different. In ways that were hard to measure, people spoke more quietly. Not from fear, but from awareness. And they stood a little straighter, as if the ceiling had been raised without anyone noticing. George Miller worked the counter with the same steady movements. Miner's hands still rough, back still stiff, but eyes clearer now, the long-held tension easing from his shoulders. He had handed over the last of what he'd kept that morning, the envelopes and drives leaving his possession at last, and the relief of no longer guarding them was visible in the way he moved lighter despite the years. Sarah Whitcomb came in just after noon, snow melting into her scarf, posture upright as ever. She ordered her usual tea, nodded to Lena, said nothing about the cruiser she had watched earlier, or the rumors already threading through the town. Sarah had lived long enough to know when silence was respectful, rather than fearful, and this was one of those times. She sat by the window, hands folded, eyes tracking the snow as it gathered, and felt the small, unfamiliar comfort of knowing that things could change, without exploding. Daniel Brooks did not return to the diner until evening, and even then he did not go inside. He parked across the street, engine idling, snow collecting lightly on the hood of his old pickup. The Belgian Malinois sat in the passenger seat, 5 years old and composed. Fawn coat darkened where melting flakes touched it, amber eyes calm but alert. He wore his matte black tactical harness now, snug and unmarked, a functional piece of gear that fit him as naturally as discipline fit his body. The dog watched the door of the diner without tension, because his handler's posture told him everything he needed to know. Daniel stepped out, and stood for a moment in the cold, snow settling on his shoulders, quiet pressing in around him. He looked older than when he had arrived days earlier, not from exhaustion, but from the kind of clarity that rearranged a man's sense of time. His NW Type 3 uniform was clean but worn, blank Velcro patches unchanged, presence still anonymous by design. He did not carry the air of someone waiting for acknowledgement, did not scan for threats, because this part was finished. Cross the street, Lena stepped into the doorway of the diner, apron still tied, hair pulled back tight against the weather. She did not wave, did not call out. She simply placed one hand flat against her chest, fingers splayed as if to steady something inside her, and inclined her head once. A small gesture that held more meaning than words ever could. Daniel met her eyes briefly, and nodded in return. Not smiling, not solemn, just present. It was enough. No one clapped. No one spoke his name. There were no speeches. No thanks offered loudly enough to carry across the street. The town did not need a symbol to rally around. It needed space to breathe. And it had been given that quietly. Daniel turned back to the truck, opened the door, slid into the driver's seat. The Malinois shifted slightly to make room, then settled again. Posture relaxed. Ready. The engine turned over with a familiar rumble, steady and unremarkable. As Daniel pulled away, snow thickened, softening the edges of the buildings, the road stretching pale and quiet ahead. He did not look back at the station or the diner, because the work here had never been about staying. It had been about standing long enough for others to find their footing. The dog rested his chin briefly on the door, ears lifting at the sound of wind, content in the rhythm of motion. The truck disappeared into the falling snow. Not fast, not slow, carrying with it a justice that had done its work, without demanding to be seen. Sometimes we wait for miracles to arrive with noise, with thunder, with clear signs that cannot be ignored. But this story reminds us that God often works in quieter ways. Not through sudden power, but through restraint. Not through revenge, but through truth that refuses to disappear. Daniel did not win because he was stronger, louder, or more violent. He won because he stood still when fear demanded silence, because he chose patience when anger would have been easier, and because he trusted that doing what was right would matter, even if no one applauded. In our daily lives, we face moments like this more often than we realize. Moments when speaking up feels risky, when staying calm feels like weakness, when walking away seems easier than standing firm. Yet, Scripture teaches us that the truth sets us free. Not immediately, not without cost, but inevitably. God does not always remove injustice in an instant. Sometimes He places ordinary people in ordinary moments and asks them to choose courage without knowing the outcome. If this story touched your heart, let it remind you that quiet integrity still carries weight, that goodness does not need permission to exist, and that even unseen choices can shift the ground beneath a broken place. Share this story so others who feel powerless may find hope. Leave a comment to let someone know they are not alone. Subscribe to Heartline Stories so more stories of truth and courage can be told. And if you believe that God still works through patience, restraint, and faith, comment Amen. May God bless you, protect you, and walk with you through every silent battle you face.